a cracked amphora, the sharp, iron scent of fresh blood, a scream swallowed by marble walls. The empress was dead. Her skull, caved in by the very foot of her husband, had spilled life across the palace floor. According to whispers that slithered through Rome like alley cats, it wasn't the first time Nero's rage had burst free, but it was the first time it ended in death. Poppaea Sabina, once the pride of the empire and heavy with child, died not by politics, poison, or plague, but by a kick to the belly. Her body, soiled and still warm, was hurriedly embalmed with spices and shut in a golden coffin. Nero wept, loudly, publicly. He did not attend the burial, but declared her a goddess. A temple would be built. A comet, if spotted, would be claimed as her soul. Still, for all his proclamations of divine grief, the emperor could not sleep. He could not eat. The halls echoed with his moaning. Poppaea haunted him, not as a ghost but as a memory etched in obsession. This was the fate of Poppaea Sabina, wife, empress, and martyr of imperial fury. Today we descend into the grotesque aftermath of her death, the tale of Sporus, a boy mutilated to become a living replacement, entangled in Nero's delusions, and swallowed whole by the Roman elite's appetite for spectacle. The imperial palace stank of vinegar and myrrh. Perfume failed to mask the moldering scent of grief that settled over Nero's court. The emperor was inconsolable. He ordered singers to croon lullabies at night, as if serenading a phantom beside him. The walls of the Palatine were soon covered in new frescoes of Poppaea, veiled, radiant, forever untouched by death. But it wasn't enough. Her image mocked him with its stillness. Nero needed motion, flesh, breath, a replacement. In the narrow corridors of the imperial servant quarters, a name was murmured, Sporus, a beautiful boy, pale, soft-faced, delicate-limbed, perhaps 13 or 14. The exact age is still debated. Roman records rarely preserve the ages of the enslaved, and Sporus's origins remain murky. Some believe he was the child of a nobleman who had fallen out of favor, others that he was born in captivity. But all agree on one thing: he resembled Poppaea. Uncannily, Nero noticed, and once he noticed, the boy's fate was sealed. In Roman society, beauty could be a blessing or a curse carved in flesh. Slaves deemed attractive were often used for pleasure or paraded as ornaments of power. But Sporus was not merely a pet. Nero wanted something more enduring, more unholy. He whispered to his surgeons. He summoned his chamberlains. He commissioned dresses, jewels, wigs. Preparations began. The term used later in court documents was castratus. But this was no ordinary castration. This was no simple ritual of gelding as done to singers or certain slaves. Nero demanded that Sporus become something closer to a woman. Modern historians argue whether this involved partial removal, full emasculation, or even primitive attempts at surgical reshaping. The details are mercifully sparse. But the intent was clear: to erase the boy's manhood and to make of him a vessel, a bride. The operation was done in secret. There was no announcement, no priest, no mourning of the boy's stolen future. Only the sickly haze of oil lamps, the press of hot blades, and the reek of cauterized flesh. Some say Sporus screamed so loud they could hear it through 3 walls. Others say he didn't make a sound. When he re-emerged, Sporus was changed. Draped in purple silks, his hair curled in the imperial style, he was rechristened in Nero's eyes, not as Sporus but as Poppaea. The emperor gave him the empress's own jewelry, shoes, and attendants. He called him his wife. He introduced him at feasts not as this boy, but as my beloved. A wedding was held, public, ritualistic, surreal. Nero wore a bridal veil himself, then lifted one from Sporus's trembling face. Contemporary historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio recorded the scene with disbelief and derision. Was it madness? Was it grief? Or something darker still, a tyrant playing God, bending flesh and history to his will? Modern scholars still debate Nero's psychological state. Some suggest deep psychosis. Others point to a Roman culture that normalized extreme sexual domination as a display of power. But one thing is clear: for Nero, Sporus was not merely a surrogate. He was Poppaea resurrected, an echo conjured in blood and silk. Meanwhile, the palace adjusted. Servants bowed. Senators smiled with tight lips. The Praetorian guards kept their eyes forward. Rome had learned long ago that Nero's whims were not to be questioned. even when those whims wore a wedding gown and bore the bruises of recent wounds. But behind the drapes, whispers brood. They say he speaks to her. I mean to him, in her voice. Did you see how the boy limps? Poison would be kinder. Sporus, whatever he once was, had vanished into the performance. A child vanished beneath the costume of a ghost. The door shut behind him like the ceiling of a tomb. Sporus stood in the dim chamber, perfumed and pale, while the emperor reclined nearby on a couch of Tyrian silk. The boy's tunic clung to his narrow frame, dyed in shades once reserved for goddesses. He did not speak. He had learned quickly that silence pleased Nero more than protest. Besides, there was little point in resisting now. The ceremony had already begun. The castration had been done in the usual way for palace eunuchs, but with imperial excess and ritual precision. Roman medical tools were crude by modern standards. Bronze scalpels, heated irons, and poultices steeped in wine or vinegar. Sporus's procedure was likely overseen by one of Nero's personal physicians, possibly Andromachus, known more for inventing theriac, a legendary poison antidote, than for gender reassignments. According to later palace scribes, the surgery was clean, a word that hides more than it reveals. There was no anesthesia beyond poppy resin and crushed mandrake root. Whether Sporus was restrained or drugged into submission is unknown. The result, however, was unmistakable. His voice never deepened. His body grew smooth and hairless. His skin retained a strange, childlike softness even as he matured. From that moment forward, Sporus ceased to exist as a Roman citizen or even as a boy. He became Augustus Secunda, the second Poppaea. The ceremony that followed was less a wedding and more a performance. Held beneath the flickering torches of Nero's private theater garden, it drew the high and low of Roman society. Senators, actors, philosophers, and generals all came to witness the grotesque union of a grieving emperor and his newly fashioned bride. Some laughed quietly into their wine. Others looked away, eyes fixed on the rose petals scattered underfoot. A few, already marked for death or exile, dared to whisper. But Nero was radiant. He wore a diadem, glistening with pearls once belonging to Cleopatra's vaults. He had Sporus draped in the same bridal veil Poppaea had worn years before, retrieved from her burial chamber. A priest of dubious loyalty muttered the marriage rites. The boy stood still as a statue, trembling only when Nero lifted the veil and kissed him on the lips before the silent crowd. It was a grotesque tableau, equal parts theater, mourning, and imperial insanity. The Roman elite, ever adaptable to survival, adjusted quickly to the new reality. Sporus was addressed with female titles. Attendants bowed to him as Augusta. At court banquets, he was seated beside the emperor, where he silently sipped wine from golden chalices too heavy for his small hands. When Nero toured the countryside in his theatrical chariots, Sporus rode beside him, cloaked in imperial regalia. Historians agree this was not simply delusion, it was power ritual. Nero believed or chose to believe that he had reversed death, that he had bent reality backward. But under this chilling fantasy lay deeper insecurities. Poppaea had been one of the few figures to control Nero, to calm his volcanic rages. Recreating her, even imperfectly, was a form of psychic self-salvation. Yet even in this twisted stability, danger festered. Some in the Senate saw Sporus as a liability, an embarrassment, a sign that Nero's descent into madness had reached an irreversible depth. One senator, whose name has been lost, is recorded to have said, "The empire rots at the loins." More disturbingly, the rumors began to change. What began as mockery became menace. There were whispers that Sporus was not just a puppet, but a participant. That he spoke with Poppaea's voice in private. That he learned her expressions, her tone. That he became her. And, perhaps most dangerous of all, that Nero began to believe it. To historians, this raises questions. Was Sporus acting to survive? Or had he been broken so thoroughly that he embraced the role? Scholarly debate continues. Some suggest Sporus suffered from a profound dissociation, what today we might call identity fragmentation. Others believe he wielded subtle influence, using Nero's grief to ensure his own protection. Yet one detail pierces through the speculation. Despite his privileged position, Sporus never smiled in any of the frescoes or carvings that depict him. A minor fact, perhaps meaningless. Or perhaps a silent scream, fossilized in marble. and still the rituals grew stranger. Nero commissioned a private drama in which he would play the role of a bereaved Orpheus descending into the underworld to rescue his beloved Eurydice, played of course by Sporus. The performance took place on an artificial lake flooded with floating lilies, beneath a sky blackened by perfumed smoke. The stage mechanics involved pulleys and trapdoors. At one point, Sporus emerged from a giant lotus flower, dressed in sheer silk and dripping with myrrh. According to a guest who would later die mysteriously, Nero wept. Even the wild beasts used for imperial hunts were dressed in ribbons for Sporus's amusement. A lion was once painted gold and paraded before the boy, who reportedly fainted. Was it terror? Was it awe? Or simply exhaustion? The palace physician recorded that Sporus began to suffer from chronic fevers, nervous tremors, and vivid nightmares. He was given snow-chilled wine and opium-infused honey to sleep. Nero in turn grew more possessive. He forbade Sporus from speaking to certain senators, from seeing old attendants, from even venturing into parts of the garden unescorted. The emperor's love, if it can be called that, began to curdle. At night, in the dark heart of the palace, Sporus would sometimes sit by the reflecting pool where Poppaea once bathed. It was said he would stare into the water until dawn, his reflection shifting in the ripples. Sometimes boy, sometimes woman, sometimes nothing at all. He had been castrated, married, crowned, and renamed. But beneath the silks, he remained a child with no past, no future, and no escape. Rome looked on entertained. Torchlight flickered on the polished marble of the Domus Aurea, casting distorted silhouettes across the palace's gold-plated walls. The boy bride, no longer Sporus, not quite Poppaea, moved like a wraith through the colonnades. Draped in flowing fabrics scented with rose oil and musk, he drifted from room to room as if trapped in a dream scripted by someone else. And in a sense he was. The marriage had not merely transformed Sporus's body, it had made him a living symbol, a grotesque centerpiece in Nero's theater of denial. Every feast, every pageant, every public display of power became a stage upon which the emperor could parade his undead love story. Sporus, silent and delicate, played his role without falter. The city, though, whispered with a mix of revulsion and awe. This was more than scandal, it was sacrilege. Rome had seen emperors defy gods, crucify rebels, and burn cities. But this was something else. To clothe a boy in a dead empress's silks. To call him Poppaea. To kiss him before the Senate. To share a bed and demand others bow before the charade. The plebeians scoffed. The patricians smiled through gritted teeth. But no one forgot. Nero's court was a place of carefully managed hallucination. Music played constantly, harps, flutes, even choirs imported from the east. Incense wafted thick through every hall. Flowers were replaced twice daily to maintain the illusion of eternal spring. Even the shadows were curated. And Sporus was always at the center. He appeared on ivory coinage beside Nero's likeness, stylized, feminized, uncaptioned, but unmistakable. He wore Poppaea's jewels, even her famed moonstone ring believed to possess softening powers. He dined from her dishes. He slept in her chamber. Nero even had her favorite scents, myrrh, cinnamon, bruised violet, recreated in perfume specifically for him. The blurring of identities was deliberate. To Nero, the line between past and present had been erased. Sporus was Poppaea now. But not everyone agreed. The imperial court had always been a hothouse of intrigue, betrayal, and cultivated smiles hiding poisoned blades. Now it had become a theater of the grotesque. At one of Nero's private banquets, held under a ceiling rigged to rain rose petals, Sporus made his formal debut to the wider elite. He was seated beside the emperor on a golden throne, veiled in translucent gauze, his lips stained with crushed berries. A performer recited verses from Ovid's Metamorphoses, comparing Sporus to Daphne transformed into a laurel tree, forever pursued, forever escaping. The metaphor was not lost on the guests. But the petals, released too quickly from the ceiling's hidden compartment, cascaded down in suffocating waves. Several guests panicked. One reportedly choked to death on a clump of flowers. Nero, oblivious, called it a divine omen. Sporus fainted. A physician rushed forward. The emperor shoved him aside and lifted the boy himself, cradling him like a broken doll. The court learned to stay silent. Behind the golden curtains, paranoia festered. Nero began suspecting conspiracies everywhere. His mother had died by his hand. his wife, Poppaea, by his foot. His tutor Seneca had been forced into suicide. Now he feared even his shadow. And Sporus was too perfect, too quiet, too similar. Was he a spy? A ghost? One evening, after drinking spiced wine laced with rare Syrian cannabis, Nero accused Sporus of betrayal. He screamed that the boy had spoken in Poppaea's voice to curse him, that her soul had returned to torment, not to comfort. Sporus, bruised and pale, was dragged from the room. He vanished for 3 days. Some believed he had been thrown into the cisterns. Others whispered he had been locked in the old chamber where Poppaea had died. When he reappeared, he bore no outward wounds. But he spoke less, moved less, laughed never. Only once was he heard uttering anything beyond "Yes, Caesar." A handmaiden claimed that as he sat by the lily pool, he whispered, "Even shadows forget their names." Still the charade continued. Nero toured Greece with Sporus in tow, presenting him as empress to distant crowds too afraid, or too confused, to protest. The Greeks, long familiar with theatrical transgressions of gender and identity, applauded dutifully. But even among them, the boy bride left unease. At the Olympic Games, Sporus was made to crown Nero with olive wreaths after he performed in musical contests rigged in his favor. The image of the emperor weeping with joy, clutching his laurels, while a castrated boy in a bridal gown stood at his side, is one that Roman historians return to with horror, fascination, and reluctant awe. Yet for Sporus, it was only the latest act in a play with no end. One fringe account, written by a minor provincial chronicler centuries later, claims that Sporus once attempted to escape. He fled the villa during Nero's stay in Corinth, dressed in the robes of a servant. He was caught within hours. The guards did not punish him. Nero insisted on that. Instead, he kissed the boy, forgave him, and declared him faithful through confusion. Others say this never happened. That Sporus never ran because he had nowhere left to run. His body, his name, his identity had all been erased. The boy was a bride. The bride was a ghost. And the ghost wore a crown. By the time Nero's world began to unravel, the rot was already bone deep. The streets of Rome buzzed with unrest. Famine had returned. Grain fleets vanished mysteriously or were hoarded for the emperor's endless spectacles. A brutal tax regime had hollowed out the middle class. Soldiers grumbled over unpaid wages. Senators plotted in whispers. Even the gods, it seemed, had turned their backs. Thunder cracked over temples, eclipses darkened feasts, and a comet streaked the skies like a divine severance. But within the domed corridors of Nero's palace, the emperor danced. His lyre concerts had become mandatory affairs. His poetry, once merely dreadful, now had to be praised as divine. And Sporus, as ever, sat by his side, silent and sparkling, eyes dulled beneath layers of fine coal. The boy, now perhaps 17, had stopped responding to his name. Whether it was trauma, defiance, or an imperial order to maintain the illusion, no one knew. Even the servants called him Augusta now. He walked barefoot on marble floors. Ate only foods once favored by Poppaea: dates stuffed with almonds, honey-soaked pastries, boiled peacock tongues. His body, starved of testosterone since castration, remained unnaturally youthful, almost prepubescent. But his eyes were older than any senator's. And Nero was slipping. One night, a fire was spotted on the Aventine Hill. Within hours, half the city was ash. It raged for over a week. Theories multiplied: Christian sabotage, urban neglect, divine punishment. But the most damning rumor, the one that hardened into myth, was that Nero himself had lit the blaze, watching it from a private stage while singing the fall of Troy. A harp in one hand, Sporus in the other. Contemporary scholars still argue over Nero's role. Some suggest accident. Others, strategic demolition for his new palace. A few fringe theorists posit that Nero, haunted by a festering grief, wanted to build a city worthy of his dead wife, and that Sporus's transformation was only the beginning. Whatever the truth, Rome never forgave him. And Sporus, watching a city choke on smoke and blood, may have understood something Nero never would. Death could not be unmade. Not by makeup. Not by silk. Not by pretending. Not even by power. As Nero's enemies multiplied, his delusions intensified. He began dreaming of Sporus's death, Poppaea's death, repeating endlessly. In some accounts, Nero would wake screaming, clawing at Sporus's face, convinced it was covered in bruises. In others, he would stroke the boy's hair for hours, murmuring apologies to a corpse he could never resurrect. He feared the Senate, feared his generals, feared the people. He began talking of fleeing Rome, of retreating to Egypt where true God still lived. He spoke of building a temple to Poppaea there, her image sculpted with Sporus's face, seated beside Isis and Osiris. The boy said nothing. And then, one final betrayal. The Senate declared Nero an enemy of the state. The Praetorian Guard turned on him. Galba marched from Hispania. Support collapsed like a rotten stage curtain. Nero fled into hiding. And Sporus, faithful or simply out of options, followed him. They took refuge in the villa of a freedman, a small estate east of Rome, surrounded by dry fig groves and whispering olive trees. Nero wept, cried out for his mother, for Poppaea, for his missing glories. He still held his lyre, still wore perfume. With him were a few loyal slaves, a dagger, and Sporus. The boy sat beside him on the cold marble floor of the bathhouse, his sheer tunic damp with condensation. Nero pressed the blade into his own throat, hesitated. His cowardice in the end matched his cruelty. "Help me," he begged. It was a freedman who completed the act, pushing Nero's hand forward, driving the blade through sinew and windpipe. The last emperor of the Julio-Claudian line died gasping, blood pooling on the tiles like spilled wine. Sporus watched, unmoving. Did he cry? Did he flinch? No account says. Only that when the corpse was finally burned and buried in secret, the boy was left behind. No one knew what to do with him. In the months that followed, Rome reshaped itself under new emperors, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, all briefly flickering before Vespasian finally seized power. But amid the chaos, Sporus drifted between households like an unwanted relic of a cursed dynasty. He became a curiosity. Otho, himself once a husband of Poppaea, took him briefly into his circle. There, Sporus's resemblance to the long-dead empress was remarked upon with eerie fascination. Some whispered that Otho slept beside the boy not out of love, but to relive what Nero had stolen. And then came Nerva. The future emperor, then a lesser noble, offered Sporus protection, a quiet villa outside Rome and a promise of peace. Sporus refused. He wandered the forum some nights, veiled in mourning silks, eyes shadowed and searching. He was neither man nor woman, neither citizen nor slave. He was a ghost of two lives, one stolen, one erased. And then, under Vitellius, the final horror. In 69 CE, during a grand festival meant to mock the excesses of Nero's court, Vitellius staged a grotesque farce. He ordered a theatrical reenactment of Nero's wedding to Sporus, cast with actors, animals, and obscene parodies. And he summoned Sporus himself to play the bride, again. The boy, now nearly 20, refused. Rather than endure the nightmare once more, he found a quiet room, a shard of broken bronze, and opened his own veins. There was no note, no speech, only a trickle of blood, a silent fall, and silence. He was buried in an unmarked grave. No procession, no chants, no laurels or lyres, no imperial cloak draped over his remains, only whispers, faint memories. The boy once named Sporus, if that was his name at all, had passed from the world like smoke from a snuffed flame. No statues, no coins, no epitaph, only the echo of a role he never chose, and the cruel laughter of Rome's historians echoing in his wake. Some said he was a victim, others a willing participant, still others, a symbol, an embodiment of all the grotesque contradictions that festered beneath Rome's golden facades. His story did not end with his death. It lingered, in satire, in tragedy, in the shudder of future emperors who read of him in the works of Suetonius or Cassius Dio, in the long, uneasy silences between declarations of power and the obscene truths of how that power was often bought, with bodies, with masks, with names. Historians still argue about Sporus's real identity. Was he a household slave born into Nero's orbit? A senator's son seized for his resemblance to Poppaea? A eunuch singer gifted to the palace? His early life is a blank parchment, no birth record, no genealogy, no trace. Some fringe scholars propose that Sporus was never his name at all, that Nero renamed him, Sporos being Greek for seed or sowing, a bitter jest for one who would never bear children, a cruel reminder of what had been taken. Or perhaps what had never been allowed to be. Others claimed that the name had symbolic weight: fertility inverted, reproduction without the body, creation through pain, love reanimated through cruelty. The academic debates remain unresolved. But what is certain is this: Sporus became the unwilling hinge between two empires. Between the decadence of Nero's twilight and the scorched earth of Rome's brutal reset, there are strange echoes. In later centuries, Byzantine records speak of boy brides offered to emperors for political flattery. In Renaissance courts, gender performance was veiled in theater and high art. In more recent eras, historians and psychologists return to the tale of Sporus as a lens for trauma, coercion, and imperial pathology. Yet even these efforts often reduce the boy to a symbol, a footnote, a curiosity, the man who was never allowed to be one. There is something particularly Roman in the way Sporus' story ends, not with a final triumph, not with martyrdom, but with grim silence. Oblivion not just accepted but expected. Even in death, he was denied authorship of his story. No one can say what he believed, what he feared, what he dreamed. But perhaps in the end, that's the most honest thing about him. He was not an icon, not a symbol, just a boy, used, broken, forgotten, and yet still unquiet. Let the noise recede now. Let the torches burn low, the marble halls empty, the echoes of lyres fade into stillness. The tale of Sporus does not end with a moral. It offers no clean lesson, no satisfying arc. It offers only shadow. A quiet figure glimpsed at the edge of history's great stage. A whisper beneath the thunder of empire. He was never meant to be remembered. His body was shaped by force, his life rewritten by a man's obsession, his death unmourned. But he endures, if not as Sporus, then as a reminder of how power erases names, of how grief distorts love, of how even the grandest empires were, at their heart, made from fragile, frightened people trying to hold on to something, no matter the cost. And so the curtain falls not on a tyrant's downfall or a rebel's last stand, but on a boy who never had a choice, who lived inside someone else's nightmare, who died trying not to become a joke. Tonight, we remember him not for who he became, but for who he might have been, if Rome had been kinder, if power had been gentler, if history had cared to ask. Let the silence linger now. Let the air still. Sporus, whoever you truly were, this whisper was for you.